Case 1. William Kelly. The call came in frantic, desperate, a man on the other end of the line begging for help, saying his girlfriend had stopped breathing. When first responders arrived at the small residence on Water Village Road in West Ossipee that December morning in 2023, what they found would mark a grim milestone in New Hampshire legal history. Christine Felzone lay unresponsive, her body covered in injuries that told a story no amount of explanation could justify. She was 33 years old and weeks away from giving birth. Before that December day, William Kelly and Christine Felzone had lived a life shaped by struggle and addiction. They met in rehabilitation, two people battling substance dependence who found each other in their darkest moments. Their relationship was turbulent, on again, off again, marked by the kind of chaos that comes when two broken people try to hold each other up. They shared a home that barely qualified as livable, a structure with no plumbing and limited electricity on a 10-acre property where goats wandered freely. Neither worked, neither had transportation, and they spent their days isolated together in that tiny space, disconnected from the world beyond their property line. What neighbors didn't see was what happened behind those closed doors. Kelly wasn't just Felzone's partner. He was a registered offender with more than 15 criminal convictions stretching back to when he was 19 years old. His record painted a troubling picture: assault, domestic violence, offenses involving minors. Court documents revealed something even more disturbing. A former girlfriend had filed for a protective order years earlier, writing in a handwritten letter that she was in danger, that Kelly had held a knife to her throat and dragged her back when she tried to escape. She described being left with brain trauma and lifelong injuries after enduring what she called torture at his hands. When she learned about Christine Felzone, she later told reporters she felt lucky to have survived. On December 17th, Kelly made that frantic call. He told dispatchers Christine was clumsy, that she had fallen, that she hadn't taken her medication. He attempted CPR while waiting for emergency services, his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine panic. But when police and paramedics entered that home, the scene didn't match his story. Christine's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her body bore more than 100 bruises and cuts. Medical examiners would later determine that nearly 1/10 of her total blood volume had spilled into her abdomen from internal trauma caused by multiple blunt force injuries. She was between 35 and 37 weeks pregnant. Neither she nor her unborn child survived. The investigation moved quickly. Authorities discovered that this wasn't a case of someone who fell or had an accident. The injuries were extensive, repeated, deliberate. Kelly told investigators they would find what they would find or wouldn't find, adding that Felzone was self-destructive. Statements that seemed designed to deflect responsibility, even as the evidence mounted against him. He repeatedly insisted he wasn't to blame, that something else had happened, that people were misunderstanding the situation. But the autopsy results were unambiguous. In March of 2024, the Carroll County Grand Jury handed down 2 indictments for second-degree murder. One charged Kelly with recklessly causing the death of Christine Felzone under circumstances showing extreme indifference to human life. The other charged him with causing the death of her unborn child, a fetus gestationally aged 20 weeks or more, through the same violent actions that ended Christine's life. This second charge represented something unprecedented in New Hampshire. Kelly became the first person in state history to face murder charges for the death of a fetus, a legal development made possible by legislation passed in 2017 that defined a fetus at 20 weeks and beyond as a person for purposes of criminal prosecution. The case drew statewide attention not only for its brutality, but for the legal ground it broke. Prosecutors argued that they didn't need to prove Kelly knew Christine was pregnant to secure a conviction on the fetal murder charge. They only needed to demonstrate that he acted recklessly, that he was aware of and consciously disregarded a substantial risk that death would result from his conduct. The court agreed, and the case proceeded on both counts. When the trial finally began in November of 2025, Kelly waived his right to attend his own proceedings, choosing instead to appear by video at select moments. Prosecutors presented the evidence methodically. The injuries, the timeline, the frantic call that didn't align with the physical reality of what had occurred. The defense argued that Kelly had been overcome with emotion, that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. But after days of testimony and evidence, something unexpected happened. The judge declared a mistrial after concerns were raised about potential violations of Kelly's constitutional rights during the proceedings. The exact nature of these concerns was not made public, but the result was clear. The case would have to be tried again. The state immediately announced plans to retry Kelly on all charges. He remains held without bail, awaiting a second trial that will once again test New Hampshire's fetal homicide law in court. For Kelly, the outcome carries the weight of history, not just for what he's accused of doing, but for what his case represents in the evolution of criminal law and the protection of unborn life. Meanwhile, the small town of Ossipee continues to grapple with a crime its police chief said was the first homicide the community had seen in at least a decade. The goats still roam the property on Water Village Road, tended to occasionally by someone from outside. The home where Christine Felzone spent her final moments stands as a reminder of how invisible suffering can be, how violence thrives in isolation, and how two lives can end in a place that should have been safe. William Kelly's story is far from over, but the legacy of this case already extends beyond him, raising questions about what justice looks like when two victims die at once, and whether the law can ever truly account for the full measure of loss. But while Kelly awaits his fate in a New Hampshire jail, another figure in the state's recent history faced sentencing for crimes that shocked the nation in a very different way. Case 2, Stacy Marie Loton. History was supposed to remember the name differently. In 2012, when voters in New Hampshire elected a transgender woman to serve in the state legislature, it marked a milestone, the first openly transgender person elected to any state legislature in the United States. The victory was celebrated as progress, a sign that barriers were breaking and representation was expanding. But that moment of hope would be short-lived, and the name attached to it would eventually become synonymous with betrayal, deception, and unthinkable harm. Before the fall, there were warning signs everywhere. Born Barry Loton, the politician who would later go by Stacy Marie Loton, first ran into legal trouble in 2008 with a conviction for conspiracy to commit credit card fraud while living in Laconia. The conviction came with a sentence of 7.5 to 15 years, though much of that time was suspended. When Loton won that historic election in 2012, representing Ward 4 in Nashua, the past wasn't disclosed during the campaign, and legally, it didn't have to be. But when the conviction surfaced just days after the election, it created an immediate problem. New Hampshire law prohibits convicted individuals from holding office until their final discharge from incarceration. And because Loton's sentence included a condition of good behavior, the Attorney General ruled that final discharge had not occurred. Within weeks, Loton resigned without ever taking the oath of office. That resignation could have been the end of the political career, a cautionary tale about background checks and vetting. But Loton wasn't finished. After finally completing the terms of the fraud sentence, including paying $2,000 in court-ordered restitution, Loton ran again in 2020 and won, this time actually serving in the New Hampshire House of Representatives. The comeback seemed complete, a second chance, a story of redemption. Except the troubles didn't stop. In 2015, Loton had been arrested for calling in a threat to Southern New Hampshire Medical Center, later pleading guilty to a reduced misdemeanor charge and receiving a suspended 6-month jail sentence. Loton blamed the incident on mental health struggles and voluntarily entered treatment. Then came arrests in 2021 for sending false emergency texts to New Hampshire's system, followed by multiple arrests in 2022 for stalking, allegations that Loton had violated a court order by posting about someone on social media. Each time, Loton managed to avoid serious consequences, continuing to serve in the legislature, even as the legal issues piled up. But in June of 2023, everything changed. Police in Nashua received a report that shook the department to its core. Individuals at a local facility told officers that Loton had been showing them images of children in situations no child should ever be in. Detectives from the Special Investigations Division moved quickly, obtaining a warrant and arresting Loton on charges of distributing material depicting the exploitation of minors. Loton was held on preventive detention, and as investigators dug deeper, the scope of what they uncovered grew more disturbing. The case wasn't just about Loton. It involved Lindsay Groves, a 40-year-old woman from Hudson who worked at a daycare center called Creative Minds in Tyngsboro, Massachusetts. Between May 2022 and June 2023, Groves had been taking inappropriate photographs of children at the facility, children between the ages of 3 and 5 during routine bathroom breaks and diaper changes. She then sent these images via text message to Loton, with whom she was in a romantic relationship. Federal investigators later revealed that the two had exchanged more than 10,000 messages, many of which included discussions about acts involving children that were too explicit to describe. When authorities searched Groves' phone, they found over 2,500 text messages between her and Loton. The conversations weren't just about sharing images. They were about intent, desire, and planning. In one exchange, Loton allegedly wrote about wanting access to the children Groves worked with. Groves responded by discussing which children she thought could enjoy it. The messages revealed a shared mindset, a mutual understanding of something society views as among the most heinous violations imaginable. Prosecutors described it as a deliberate conspiracy to exploit the most vulnerable. Loton's political career, already marred by repeated legal issues, was now completely obliterated. The New Hampshire Democratic Party, which had supported Loton through earlier controversies, went silent. Loton resigned from the legislature in December of 2022 after the stalking arrest, but by the time the exploitation charges came in 2023, there was no position left to resign from, only a reputation in freefall and a legal battle that would determine whether Loton would spend decades behind bars. In October of 2025, Lindsay Groves entered a guilty plea in federal court in Boston, admitting to charges related to the exploitation of children and distribution of unlawful material. A month later, in November, Loton followed suit, pleading guilty to 3 counts involving the exploitation of minors. The plea deal came with a sentencing recommendation that would reshape the rest of Loton's life. Federal guidelines for such offenses carry a minimum of 15 years and a maximum of 30 years in prison, along with the possibility of lifetime supervised release and fines reaching up to $250,000. Sentencing is scheduled for February 2026, and legal experts predict that Loton will receive a sentence on the harsher end of the spectrum, given the nature of the offenses and the number of victims involved. Groves faces a similar fate. Both will likely spend the better part of their remaining years in federal custody, separated from society and from each other. For the families of the children involved, the damage is incalculable. Parents who trusted a daycare to keep their children safe discovered that their trust had been violated in the worst possible way. Some of the victims were so young they may never fully understand what happened to them, while others will carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. Advocacy groups have called for stronger protections for children in childcare settings, including mandatory surveillance and more rigorous background checks for employees and anyone connected to them. The case also reignited debates about accountability, second chances, and how society handles individuals with repeated criminal histories. Loton had been given multiple opportunities to change course, after fraud, after the threat, after false emergency calls, after stalking. Each time, the system offered leniency, treatment, or probation, and each time, the pattern continued. By the time the exploitation charges emerged, some in law enforcement and politics were asking whether earlier interventions could have prevented what came next. The historic significance of Loton's 2012 election is now inseparable from the crimes that followed. What was once celebrated as a breakthrough moment is now a painful reminder that identity and representation mean nothing without integrity and responsibility. The first transgender legislator in American history will instead be remembered as a convicted criminal whose actions harmed the most innocent. When the gavel falls in February 2026, Loton will face the consequences of choices that destroyed lives, shattered trust, and turned a legacy of possibility into one of unimaginable harm. And in a New Hampshire courtroom, justice will finally be delivered, not for political history, but for the children who deserve so much better. Yet even as one historic case moved toward sentencing, another New Hampshire tragedy had already reached its conclusion. A father convicted of ending his own daughter's life in a crime that exposed the failures of an entire system. Case 3. Adam Montgomery. She was 5 years old, blonde hair, glasses, a smile that her foster mother said could light up a room. Harmony Montgomery loved being a big sister, adored Minnie Mouse, and deserved a childhood filled with safety and love. Instead, she got Adam Montgomery. The story of Harmony's short life is also the story of a system that failed at every turn. Born in 2014 to parents who struggled with addiction and were never together, Harmony moved between her biological mother, Crystal Sorey's home, and foster care multiple times in her earliest years. Massachusetts Child Protective Services were involved from the beginning, monitoring a situation that was unstable but not yet catastrophic. Then in 2019, despite Adam Montgomery's lengthy criminal record and the fact that he had spent most of Harmony's life in prison, a judge awarded him full custody. Adam had spent only 20 hours with his daughter during supervised visits. He had no stable home, no history of successful parenting, and a documented pattern of violence. But the court gave him Harmony anyway, and he moved her to New Hampshire to live with him, his wife Kayla, and their 2 young sons. Almost immediately, the abuse began. Harmony was subjected to beatings, forced to stand in corners for hours, denied food, and treated as a burden rather than a child. When Adam's uncle Kevin visited from Florida and noticed Harmony had a black eye, Adam allegedly told him he had bashed her around. Friends and co-workers heard different explanations: a soccer accident, a mishap with foam swords. But the truth was far darker. In late 2019, the family was evicted and began living in their car, a Chrysler Sebring parked in Manchester. Inside that vehicle, with 3 children crammed into the back seat, Adam and Kayla used substances while Harmony suffered. She had trouble with bathroom accidents, a problem that hadn't existed before homelessness. And Adam's response was rage. On the morning of December 7th, 2019, the family was driving to a methadone clinic when Harmony had another accident in the car. Adam snapped. Prosecutors later described how he began hitting her in the head with a closed fist over and over as they drove through Manchester. They stopped at a Burger King, and the assault continued at red lights, at stop signs, blow after blow to a 5-year-old's skull. Kayla Montgomery, sitting in the passenger seat, later testified that she heard a sound during one of the punches, a crack. Adam felt it too, but he didn't stop. He kept hitting until Harmony stopped moving. By the time they reached the parking lot of their destination, Harmony was dead. Adam placed her body in a duffel bag and stored it in the trunk of the car. For the next 3 months, as investigators would later piece together, he moved that bag from place to place like cargo, desperate to hide what he had done. The body went into piles of snow. It was stored in a cooler in the hallway of his mother-in-law's apartment building. It was hidden in a ceiling vent at a homeless shelter. It was kept in a workplace freezer. Adam even attempted to speed decomposition by using lime. Finally, in March of 2020, he rented a moving truck and drove into Massachusetts. Toll records show the truck crossing the Tobin Bridge multiple times. Somewhere along a 26-mile route, Adam disposed of Harmony's remains. Her body has never been found. For nearly 2 years, no one reported Harmony missing. Adam told people she was with her mother. Crystal Sorey, Harmony's biological mom, tried repeatedly to reach Adam, asking about her daughter, wanting to see her. Adam blocked her on social media. It wasn't until November of 2021, after Crystal hadn't seen Harmony since a FaceTime call in April 2019, that she finally contacted police. When Manchester authorities began investigating, they discovered something horrifying. No one had checked on Harmony in more than 2 years. Not child services, not the schools, not any oversight agency. A 5-year-old girl had vanished into a broken system and nobody noticed. The case exploded into public view. In August of 2022, Manchester Police Chief Alan Aldenburg and New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella held a press conference announcing they believed Harmony was deceased and that her father had taken her life. Adam Montgomery was arrested and charged with second-degree killing, assault, falsifying evidence, witness tampering, and abuse of remains. Kayla Montgomery, who had helped conceal the body, was charged with perjury after lying to a grand jury. She later accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Adam in exchange for an 18-month sentence. When the trial began in February of 2024, Adam refused to attend. He waived his right to be present in the courtroom, appearing only briefly via video to admit guilt on 2 lesser charges: falsifying evidence and abuse of remains. But on the charge that mattered most, second-degree ending of life, he maintained his innocence. His defense attorney tried to shift blame to Kayla, suggesting she was responsible for Harmony's death and that Adam had only helped cover it up. Prosecutors countered with a mountain of evidence: testimony from Kayla describing the violence in detail, statements from family members who had witnessed the abuse, forensic analysis of the locations where the body had been stored, and records showing Adam's attempts to hide his actions. The jury deliberated for about 7 hours across 2 days. On February 22, 2024, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all charges, including second-degree ending of life. Adam Montgomery was not in the courtroom when the decision was read. Harmony's biological mother, Crystal Sorey, was there, along with her foster mother, Michelle Raftery. Both women wept. At sentencing in May, Adam was finally required to appear in person. The judge had ruled he couldn't avoid facing the consequences of what he had done. Victim impact statements filled the courtroom with grief and fury. Crystal Sorey spoke directly to Adam, asking if Harmony cried for her, if she screamed, if she begged him to stop. She told him she hoped he would hear Harmony's voice and her giggle every day for the rest of his life. Kayla Montgomery, now Adam's ex-wife, also submitted a statement saying he was not the person she had married, that he had changed into someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. Harmony's adoptive brother Jameson, through his 2 fathers, asked why Adam had taken his sister away. Judge Amy Messer sentenced Adam Montgomery to 45 years to life for the killing, to be served consecutively with sentences for the other charges, a minimum total of more than 56 years in prison. She told him he had treated Harmony's body like trash, worse than trash, and that he had done unimaginable things to her remains. Adam, already serving more than 30 years on unrelated weapons charges, will likely die in prison. But the case didn't end with the conviction. It sparked outrage and demands for reform. How had a violent father with no parenting experience been given custody of a vulnerable child? Why hadn't anyone checked on Harmony for 2 years? Investigations revealed catastrophic failures by child protective agencies in both Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The Massachusetts Office of the Child Advocate issued a scathing report, and both states implemented new policies meant to prevent similar tragedies. Lawmakers proposed Harmony's Law, which would prevent convicted individuals from profiting off their victim's death or inheriting from their estate. Manchester police have vowed to continue searching for Harmony's remains. Chief Aldenberg has said that as long as he's on the job, roughly 15 more years, he will keep looking. Prosecutors believe her body is somewhere along that 26-mile route Adam took in the rental truck, but despite searches in marshy areas near Revere, Massachusetts, she has never been found. Adam Montgomery recently filed an appeal, arguing that his trial was unfair because assault charges from July 2019 were combined with the December killing charge, creating prejudice. He also claims that evidence of prior bad acts shouldn't have been admitted and that showing body camera footage without audio violated his rights. Legal experts believe the appeal has little chance of success. Harmony Montgomery's life was brief, brutal, and stolen by the person who should have protected her most. Her death exposed how easily children can slip through the cracks when systems prioritize parental rights over child safety. And while Adam Montgomery will spend the rest of his life behind bars, Harmony remains missing. A little girl who loved Minnie Mouse, who deserved so much more, and who the world failed in every way that mattered. Even as New Hampshire reeled from Harmony's case, another violent act was unfolding in Laconia, one driven not by parental rage, but by anger over words spoken between friends. Case 4, Hassan Sapri. The friendship started at college, years before everything went wrong. Hassan Sapri and Wilfred Guzman had been roommates once, 2 men from different generations who somehow connected. Sapri, an Iraqi refugee who had fled wartime violence with his family, found stability in New Hampshire, and eventually a friendship with Guzman, a 57-year-old man who welcomed him into his life. They stayed in touch after college ended. Sapri visited Guzman's townhouse on Blueberry Lane in Laconia regularly. To outsiders, they looked like family. But on the night of April 17, 2019, that friendship would end in unimaginable violence. Hassan Sapri's early life had been marked by trauma. Born in Iraq, he witnessed horrors most people can't fathom. His father worked as a diplomat's bodyguard and driver before being kidnapped by sectarian militants. The family paid an $80,000 ransom to secure his release, and in 2008, they fled to the United States as refugees. But the scars of growing up in a war zone didn't disappear when they crossed the ocean. Sapri struggled with what mental health professionals would later describe as severe psychological issues stemming from childhood exposure to suicide bombings, improvised explosive devices, and constant threats. His attorneys would later argue that those experiences left him mentally unstable, unable to control his impulses when triggered. On that April evening, Sapri arrived at Guzman's home around 10:30 at night. He didn't park in front of the townhouse as he normally did. Instead, he left his vehicle in a lot some distance away and walked to the residence. Prosecutors would later point to this as evidence of planning, of premeditation. Sapri wore gloves when he knocked on the door. Guzman let him in without hesitation. They were friends, after all. The two men sat down and watched television for a while. Then they began talking. The conversation turned to history, religion, and race, and something Guzman said made Sapri what he later described as super angry. What happened next was brutal beyond comprehension. According to court testimony, Sapri grabbed a kitchen knife and attacked. Guzman fought back, trying to escape, but Sapri was relentless. He slammed Guzman's head into the oven door. He grabbed a samurai sword that had been mounted on the wall as decoration and used it to strike his friend repeatedly. He used a kitchen fork. He used other utensils, whatever he could find. Medical examiners would later determine that Guzman suffered more than 140 wounds to his head, neck, and body. The attack was frenzied, chaotic, overwhelming. Guzman had defensive wounds on his hands, evidence that he tried desperately to protect himself, but there was no stopping what was happening. When it was over, Guzman lay dead on the floor of his own home. Sapri didn't call for help. He didn't flee immediately. Instead, he stood over the body and, according to prosecutors, watched his friend die. Then he began covering his tracks. He took Guzman's phone and threw it into Lake Winnisquam. He stole the man's wallet and credit cards. Over the next 2 days, he attempted to use those cards to purchase items on PlayStation, as if nothing had happened. He wrapped Guzman's body and placed a jacket over the face, perhaps unable to look at what he had done. Meanwhile, Guzman's son, a police officer from Staten Island, was trying to reach his father. He had traveled to Laconia for Easter weekend to visit, planning a family reunion. When no one answered the door at his father's townhouse, concern turned to alarm. On April 19th, 2 days after the attack, Guzman's son asked police to conduct a welfare check. When officers entered the residence, they found the scene: blood, broken furniture, shattered glass, a broken samurai sword, and Wilfred Guzman's body. Investigators immediately knew this wasn't a burglary or a random act. This was personal, violent, and deliberate. Authorities quickly focused on Sapri. They learned he had been a frequent visitor to the home and had a close relationship with both Guzman and his daughter. They discovered evidence linking him to the crime scene and to the stolen credit cards. On April 23rd, Sapri went into hiding. For 3 days, he evaded police by hiding in a vacant home on Edgewater Avenue, cutting through a screen to gain entry. On April 26th, authorities finally arrested him at his parents' home on Pleasant Street. During a police interview in which he waived his Miranda rights, Sapri confessed in detail to what he had done. But his confession came with an explanation that would shape the legal battle to come. Sapri told investigators that Guzman had said things during their argument that made him lose control, that the conversation about race and religion had triggered something deep inside him that he couldn't contain. His defense team seized on this narrative, arguing that Sapri was not guilty by reason of insanity. They presented evidence of his traumatic childhood in wartime Iraq, the violence he had witnessed, the instability he had endured. They brought in mental health experts who testified that Sapri suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and other conditions that impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong during moments of extreme emotional distress. The prosecution countered that Sapri's actions showed clear signs of planning and awareness. He had parked away from the house. He wore gloves. He disposed of evidence. He attempted to use stolen credit cards days after the offense. These were not the actions of someone who was completely detached from reality, they argued. These were the actions of someone trying to avoid getting caught. The first trial began in August of 2022. For weeks, jurors heard testimony about the crime scene, the relationship between Sapri and Guzman, and the defendant's mental state. But before the defense could present its full case, Judge Elizabeth Leonard declared a mistrial. The reasons were sealed from the public, but reports suggested the judge had concerns about competency issues. The trial ended abruptly, leaving Guzman's family devastated and without closure. For years, the case sat in legal limbo. Competency evaluations were ordered, hearings were held behind closed doors, and the public waited. Guzman's son spoke to reporters multiple times, expressing frustration with the delays and his fear that justice would never come. He worried that Sapri might be sent to a hospital instead of prison, that mental illness would become an excuse rather than an explanation. His children, who had been young when their grandfather died, continued asking when the person responsible would be held accountable. Finally, in August of 2025, a second trial began. This time, the proceedings moved forward without interruption. Prosecutors presented the same evidence of premeditation and deliberate concealment. The defense again argued insanity, framing Sapri as a victim of his own traumatic past, someone whose brain had been irreparably damaged by childhood exposure to war. On September 4th, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Hassan Sapri guilty on all charges, including first-degree involvement in ending a life, theft, criminal trespass, and 4 counts of attempted credit card misuse. They rejected the insanity defense, determining that Sapri knew what he was doing and understood the consequences. On October 8, 2025, Sapri was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Members of Guzman's family read victim impact statements, describing a loving man and protector whose life was stolen in the place he should have felt safest. Guzman's son told reporters afterward that justice had been a long time coming, but that the sentence allowed the family to move forward. There was no sense of closure, he said, only relief that the ordeal was finally over. Hassan Sapri, now in his late 20s, will spend the rest of his life behind bars. His case became a study in the limits of the insanity defense, a reminder that mental illness and trauma, while real and significant, do not always absolve someone of responsibility for their actions. And for the Guzman family, the verdict couldn't bring back the man they lost, but it ensured that his memory wouldn't be overshadowed by legal uncertainty. Yet as one case involving a sword reached its conclusion, another tragedy in New Hampshire had already unfolded, one driven not by ancient trauma, but by modern obsession and a debt that could never be repaid. Case 5. Timothy Verrill. The bodies were hidden beneath a porch, wrapped in tarps and trash bags, concealed in a place no one would think to look. When Dean Smorok returned to his Farmington home on January 29, 2017, after being out of town, he found evidence of something terrible: blood, signs of a struggle. And when he looked under the porch at 979 Meterboro Road, he discovered 2 women who had been in his life. One his girlfriend, the other her houseguest, both deceased in ways that spoke of rage and desperation. Christine Sullivan was 48 years old, a woman with a dynamic personality who loved fundraising for causes she believed in. She had lived a complicated life, marked by struggles with substance use, but also moments of genuine connection and hope. Jenna Pellegrini was 32, a mother of 2 who had been trying to leave behind a lifestyle of addiction and drinking. In the days before her passing, she had been texting family members, saying she missed her children and was ready to ask for help. Both women were caught in the orbit of New Hampshire's substance trade, a world where debts carried weight and paranoia ran deep. Timothy Verrill was 34 years old in January of 2017, a man from Dover with a lengthy history of substance issues and a reputation for being involved in activities that skirted the law. Prosecutors would later describe him as a paranoid dealer who believed people were informing on him, who saw threats everywhere, and who was willing to use violence to protect himself. Verrill and Christine Sullivan had a complicated relationship tied to substance transactions. According to evidence presented at trial, Verrill believed Sullivan owed him money, a $1,000 debt tied to controlled substances. And in his mind, that debt was worth taking a life. On the night of January 27, 2017, Verrill went to the home on Meterboro Road in Farmington. Christine Sullivan was there, along with Jenna Pellegrini, who was staying as a guest. What happened inside that basement apartment was methodical and brutal. Verrill used multiple weapons, a regular kitchen knife to start, then progressed to more violent tools. Christine Sullivan was struck in the head repeatedly with a blunt object and then cut 8 times. She fought back, evidenced by defensive wounds on her hands where she tried to shield herself from the attack. Jenna Pellegrini, who prosecutors believe was asleep when Verrill turned on her, was struck with an object and then cut more than 40 times. The medical examiner, who later examined the bodies, testified that both women perished from multiple penetrating wounds, and the manner was ruled as ending by another person. After the attacks, Verrill didn't immediately flee. He spent time attempting to clean up the scene, wrapping the bodies in tarps and plastic and hiding them under the porch. He altered bloodstains on the exterior of the residence and concealed blood-stained items in trash bags in the basement. Prosecutors argued that these actions showed clear intent to hide evidence and avoid detection. It wasn't a crime of passion that ended in panic. It was calculated violence followed by deliberate concealment. When Dean Smoronk, Sullivan's boyfriend and business partner in illegal activities, returned from Florida on January 28th, he initially didn't suspect anything was wrong. But the next day, he noticed signs of disturbance and eventually discovered the bodies. He called police, and investigators arrived to a scene that would haunt even experienced officers. The level of violence, the number of wounds, and the manner in which the bodies had been hidden all pointed to someone who wanted to send a message or eliminate perceived threats. Authorities quickly identified Verrill as a suspect. Evidence placed him at the scene. His fingerprints were found on trash bags, plastic cups, tape, and a spray paint can used to alter bloodstains. His DNA was collected from various items, though notably it was excluded from material taken from Sullivan's rings, which she wore while fighting her attacker. Witnesses testified that Verrill had been acting strangely in the days after the incidents. His own brother, Jeffrey Verrill, told the court that Timothy seemed off when they spoke on January 29th, and that instead of meeting with the state trooper as planned, Timothy changed the license plates on his girlfriend's vehicle and drove away. When investigators finally caught up with him on January 30th, Verrill had visible injuries to his forearm and right index finger, wounds consistent with someone who had been in a violent struggle. Verrill was arrested on February 7th, 2017, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree involvement in ending life, 2 counts of reckless second-degree actions resulting in the same, and 5 counts of falsifying physical evidence. His first trial began in 2019, but it ended in a mistrial after it was determined that state police had failed to share crucial evidence with the defense. Families of both victims were devastated by the delay, forced to relive the trauma without resolution. The second trial finally took place in early 2024. Prosecutors painted Verrill as a paranoid individual who acted out of a belief that Pellegrini was a police informant and that Sullivan owed him money. They presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own suspicious behavior in the days following the incidents. The defense, led by attorney Julia Nye, argued that investigators had zeroed in on the wrong person and suggested that others, including Joshua Colwell and Dean Smoronk, should have been investigated more thoroughly. They pointed out that Smoronk had sent Sullivan threatening text messages in the days before her passing and had even allegedly offered money to someone in Florida to harm her. However, Smoronk had been out of town when the women were attacked, a fact confirmed by multiple sources. On April 9th, 2024, the jury returned with a split verdict. They found Timothy Verrill not guilty of first-degree charges, but guilty of 2 counts of second-degree actions, resulting in loss of life. They also found him guilty on all 5 counts of falsifying physical evidence. The verdict meant that while jurors didn't believe Verrill had acted with premeditation and purpose, they did believe he had recklessly caused the deaths under circumstances showing extreme indifference to human life. Sentencing came on May 17th, 2024. Before imposing the sentence, the judge stated it might be the most disturbing case he had seen in 38 years of criminal law. Family members of both victims gave emotional statements. Michael Pellegrini, Jenna's father, told the court that life in prison was the only fair option, that he didn't want his grandchildren to ever worry about Verrill being released. Amy Bryan, Jenna's mother, said she hoped what Verrill had done would haunt him forever. Statements were also read on behalf of the Sullivan family, expressing similar sentiments of grief and a desire for maximum punishment. The judge sentenced Verrill to 45 years to life on each second-degree conviction, to be served consecutively, a total of 90 years. Additionally, he received 3.5 to 7 years for the falsifying evidence charges, also to be served consecutively. In total, Timothy Verrill, now in his early 40s, is serving a sentence that ensures he will die in prison. The case exposed the dark underbelly of New Hampshire's substance trade, where debts are settled with violence and paranoia drives people to unthinkable acts. It also highlighted systemic failures in evidence handling by state police, failures that delayed justice for years. And it left 2 families forever changed, mourning women who were trying to rebuild their lives when those lives were stolen. Timothy Verrill remains incarcerated at New Hampshire State Prison, a man who traded $1,000 and paranoid suspicions for the rest of his freedom. And in Farmington, the home on Meterboro Road stands as a grim reminder of what happened there on a cold January night in 2017. But while Verrill's case centered on the substance trade, another New Hampshire story would expose a very different kind of violence, one hidden behind the walls of an elite institution, masked as Case 6, Owen Labrie. The invitation came through email, a message sent between students at one of America's most prestigious boarding schools. Owen Labrie, 18 years old and days away from graduation, reached out to Chessie Prout, a 15-year-old freshman, asking her to meet him. The invitation was part of something called the Senior Salute, an unofficial tradition at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, where graduating seniors would invite younger students on what were framed as dates before leaving campus. But beneath the surface of this so-called tradition was something darker, a competition among senior boys to see who could engage with the most underclass women before receiving their diplomas. Owen Labrie seemed like the model St. Paul's student. He was academically accomplished, well-liked, and Harvard-bound. He sang in the choir, participated in campus activities, and carried himself with the confidence of someone destined for success. To many, he represented everything the elite boarding school stood for: privilege, promise, and polish. But on the night of May 30th, 2014, in a mechanical room inside the school's math and science building, that image would shatter completely. Chessie Prout agreed to meet Labrie, believing it was simply a friendly interaction with an older student. She was new to the school, still navigating the social dynamics of a place where traditions ran deep and hierarchy mattered. When they met that evening, they talked, they kissed, and at some point, things began to escalate. According to Prout's testimony, she told Labrie no 3 times. She described feeling frozen, unable to move or fully process what was happening. She later told investigators and the court, "I was violated in so many ways." Labrie's version of events was entirely different. He claimed the encounter was mutual, that both participants were willing, and that nothing happened without consent. He denied that full contact occurred, suggesting instead that the interaction was limited and consensual. But physical evidence and Prout's account painted a different picture, one that prosecutors believed showed a young man taking advantage of someone who was legally unable to consent, regardless of what she said or didn't say. The case went to trial in August of 2015, and it quickly became a national story. Cameras filled the courtroom in Concord as testimony revealed the inner workings of St. Paul's School and the culture surrounding the Senior Salute. Classmates testified about the tradition, describing it as a rite of passage where senior boys kept informal scores of their encounters. Prosecutors argued that Labrie saw Prout as another name on a list, another conquest before graduation. The defense countered that the encounter was consensual and that Prout had willingly participated. The jury deliberated and returned with a split verdict that left both sides unsatisfied. Labrie was found not guilty on 3 counts of the most serious charges, which carried potential sentences of 10 to 20 years each. However, he was found guilty on 3 counts of misdemeanor offenses involving a minor under the age of consent, guilty of using computer services to arrange the meeting, and guilty of endangering the welfare of a child. The computer charge was particularly significant because it required Labrie to register as an offender for life, a consequence that would follow him far beyond any prison sentence. In October of 2015, the judge sentenced Labrie to 12 months in jail. During the sentencing, the judge looked directly at Labrie and said, "You are a very good liar." Those words echoed through the courtroom, a stark contrast to the image Labrie had presented of himself as a misunderstood young man. Harvard immediately rescinded his acceptance, and the life he had planned evaporated overnight. Labrie served most of his sentence, but was released in June of 2019 for good behavior. Even after his release, legal battles continued. His attorneys filed motions for a new trial, arguing that the computer charge shouldn't apply because St. Paul's email system was an intranet, not the internet, and that the underlying charges for which he had been acquitted should negate the computer conviction. The New Hampshire Supreme Court rejected these arguments, and Labrie's conviction stood. For Chessie Prout, the aftermath of the trial was in many ways as traumatic as the initial incident. She faced bullying from former classmates, felt abandoned by the school she had trusted, and watched as some in the St. Paul's community rallied around Labrie, raising money for his legal defense. A friend's father helped pay for Labrie's attorney, and emails circulated among St. Paul's parents asking for donations, actions that made Prout feel as though the entire community had turned against her. She eventually left the school, unable to remain in an environment where she felt unsupported and blamed. In 2016, Prout's parents filed a lawsuit against St. Paul's School in federal court, alleging that the institution had fostered, permitted, and condoned a tradition of harmful behavior that directly led to their daughter's assault. The lawsuit claimed the school failed to protect her and prioritized its reputation over student safety. St. Paul's initially responded by threatening to reveal Prout's name publicly, arguing that her supporters were using media attention to attack the school's reputation from behind anonymity. This move backfired spectacularly. In August of 2016, Prout decided to go public with her identity, appearing on NBC's Today show and reclaiming her narrative. "I'm not going to let them silence me," she told the audience. In January of 2018, St. Paul's settled the lawsuit with the Prout family. The terms of the settlement were kept confidential, but the school acknowledged that Prout's case had brought about positive changes on campus, including enhanced training for faculty on adolescent relationships and consent, upgraded security measures, and a ban on the senior salute tradition. Prout went on to co-found a nonprofit organization called I Have the Right To, which provides resources and advocacy for survivors. She published a book in 2018 titled I Have the Right To, a high school survivor's story, and has spoken publicly about her experiences, becoming a voice for countless others who have faced similar situations. She has criticized St. Paul's for what she views as ongoing failures to address its culture, and has called out institutions that prioritize reputation over accountability. Owen Libery, now in his late 20s, has largely stayed out of the public eye since his release. He attempted to appeal his conviction multiple times without success and continues to be registered as an offender, a status that will follow him for the rest of his life. The case marked a turning point in how elite boarding schools are viewed, forcing conversations about privilege, accountability, and the hidden cultures that can thrive behind ivy-covered walls. St. Paul's School faced additional scrutiny in 2017 when reports emerged of another contest involving students and harmful behavior, leading to a criminal investigation by New Hampshire authorities. The school has since implemented numerous reforms, but for many, the damage to its reputation remains. The Libery case became a symbol of how power dynamics and institutional culture can enable harm, and how survivors who speak out often face battles far beyond the courtroom. Chessie Prout's courage in coming forward and refusing to be silenced changed not just her own life, but the broader conversation about consent, privilege, and justice. And as St. Paul's School grappled with the fallout from that case, another story in New Hampshire was unfolding, one involving not a boarding school tradition, but a relationship built on mutual interest in darkness. Case 7. Seth Mazzaglia. The invitation seemed innocent enough. Come over and watch a movie. Lizzie Marriott, a 19-year-old sophomore at the University of New Hampshire, agreed to visit her co-worker's apartment on the evening of October 9th, 2012. She was studying marine biology, volunteering at the New England Aquarium, and living the kind of life that spoke of passion and purpose. She had met Catherine McDonough while working at a Target store in Greenland, and the two had become friendly enough that a casual movie night didn't raise any concerns. But Lizzie had no idea that the invitation wasn't what it seemed, and that she would never leave that Dover apartment alive. Seth Mazzaglia was 31 years old in 2012, a former University of New Hampshire theater graduate who worked as a karate instructor and performed in community theater. To those who knew him casually, he seemed passionate about his hobbies and deeply involved in his relationship with his live-in girlfriend, Catherine McDonough. But behind closed doors, their relationship revolved around control, domination, and practices that went far beyond what most would consider acceptable. Mazzaglia had specific expectations for their intimate life, expectations that included bringing other people into their activities. And when McDonough couldn't find willing participants, he allegedly ordered her to lure someone who didn't know what she was walking into. When Lizzie arrived at the apartment that evening, McDonough greeted her warmly. They settled in to watch a movie, and for a while, everything seemed normal. But according to testimony that would later emerge at trial, Mazzaglia had other plans. Prosecutors would argue that he asked Lizzie to participate in activities she wasn't comfortable with. Not once, but twice. And both times, she said no. For a man described by witnesses as domineering and unaccustomed to rejection, that refusal was unacceptable. What happened next, according to McDonough's testimony after she received immunity, was calculated and brutal. As Lizzie sat watching the movie, Mazzalia allegedly snuck up behind her with a rope and strangled her. McDonough claimed she left the room briefly, and when she returned, she found Mazzalia violating Lizzie's lifeless body. The young woman who had come over for a simple movie night was gone, her future stolen in an act of rage and control. After Lizzie was deceased, the couple faced a choice: call for help, admit what happened, face the consequences. Instead, they chose concealment. They wrapped her body and disposed of it in the Piscataqua River off Pierce Island in Portsmouth, a waterway known for its strong tides and dangerous currents. Lizzie Marriott's body has never been recovered. Her family would never have the closure of laying her to rest. For 2 days, no one knew what had happened. Lizzie's car was found in a parking lot on the UNH campus, but she was nowhere to be found. Friends became concerned when she didn't respond to messages. Her family, back in Westboro, Massachusetts, grew frantic. Police began investigating, and thanks to Lizzie's friends, they quickly learned she had planned to visit Catherine McDonough that night. When investigators recovered text messages between the two women, they had a timeline and a location. Seth Mazzaglia and Catherine McDonough were questioned separately. During an 11-hour interview with police, Mazzaglia eventually led detectives to Pierce Island and showed them where he claimed he had disposed of Lizzie's body. Authorities searched the area extensively, but the Currents had done their work. Lizzie was gone. Initially, McDonough told investigators that Lizzie had passed during an accidental encounter involving restraints, rough activity between two women that went wrong. But her story kept changing. After being granted immunity from prosecution on the most serious charges, she changed her account entirely, testifying that Mazzalia had strangled Lizzie and then violated her remains while McDonough was out of the room. She admitted to helping dispose of the body, to deleting text messages, and to lying to police, but she placed full responsibility for the violence on her boyfriend. Evidence collected from a dumpster outside their apartment building supported the prosecution's case. Investigators found a trash bag containing Lizzie's clothing and a pair of men's underwear with DNA from both Mazzalia and Marriott. Forensic evidence that prosecutors argued proved their theory. Meanwhile, 2 of Mazzalia's friends testified that they had been called to the apartment that night and had seen Lizzie's body on the floor. One witness, Roberta Gherkin, a tarot card reader and friend of Mazzalia, testified that she saw the body and heard Mazzalia say, "I've gone too far, I've gone too far." Despite witnessing this scene, neither Gherkin nor her boyfriend called police that night or in the days that followed, a decision that shocked the public and sparked debate about moral responsibility versus legal obligation. The trial began in May of 2014 and lasted for weeks. Prosecutors painted Mazzalia as a controlling individual who couldn't handle rejection and who had orchestrated Lizzie's presence in the apartment specifically to fulfill his desires. The defense argued that Lizzie had agreed to the encounter and that her passing was accidental, the result of consensual activity that went wrong. They tried to introduce evidence about Lizzie's private life to suggest she had an interest in similar activities, but the judge largely blocked this strategy, ruling that her past was irrelevant to whether she had consented on that specific night. On June 27, 2014, after deliberating for less than 2 days, the jury found Seth Mazzaglia guilty of first-degree involvement in ending a life, both for strangling Lizzie before, during, or after violating her, and for causing her demise during the commission of a felony act. He was also convicted of conspiracy to falsify evidence and conspiracy to tamper with witnesses. When the verdict was read, Mazzalia showed no emotion. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, facing an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing in August of 2014, Lizzie's family addressed Mazzalia directly. Her mother, Melissa Marriott, spoke in a firm voice. "I want you to know that I unequivocally hate you. You are a cowardly, despicable person. You stole our smart, vivacious, beautiful daughter from us. You took Lizzie, violated her lifeless body, and threw her away because Lizzie had the self-confidence and the self-esteem to say no to you." Lizzie's father, Bob Marriott, embraced a police officer after the verdict and told reporters that while they were grateful for justice, no sentence would ever soothe their grief. At least 8 jurors who had convicted Mazzalia attended the sentencing, a testament to how deeply the case had affected everyone involved. Catherine McDonough, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received a vastly different fate. She pleaded guilty to hindering prosecution and was sentenced to 1.5 to 3 years in prison. She served the full 3 years and was released in July of 2016, free to move forward with her life while Lizzie's family continued to grieve. Mazzalia appealed his conviction multiple times, arguing that evidence about Lizzie's past should have been admissible and that his trial had been unfair. The New Hampshire Supreme Court rejected his arguments, ruling that the fact that Lizzie may have had certain interests in the past did not make it more probable that she had consented to what happened in that Dover apartment. His conviction and sentence were upheld. Today, Seth Mazzalia, now in his early 40s, is serving life without parole at the New Hampshire State Prison in Berlin. Lizzie Marriott's family has never been able to hold a funeral or visit a grave. Her body remains somewhere in the waters off Portsmouth, a heartbreaking reminder of a life cut short by violence disguised as desire. The case became the subject of extensive media coverage, including a feature on the television program 48 Hours, titled Dangerous Games. It exposed the dangers of control, manipulation, and the terrible consequences when someone refuses to accept the word no. And it left a community asking how 2 people could witness a body on the floor and walk away without calling for help, a question that continues to haunt everyone who followed the case. While Mazzalia's life sentence ensures he will never walk free, another New Hampshire case raised even more profound questions about justice, punishment, and whether a sentence can remain valid when the law itself has changed. Case 8. Michael Addison. The call came in at 2:45 in the morning on October 16, 2006. A domestic disturbance in Manchester, reports of gunfire. Officer Michael Briggs, 35 years old, a Marine veteran, and a 5-year member of the Manchester Police Department, responded alongside his partner. They were 15 minutes from the end of their shift. As they approached a dark alley, they encountered a man who would change the course of New Hampshire legal history. Within moments, a single shot rang out, and Officer Briggs fell to the ground with a wound to his head. He was rushed to the hospital, but passed away the next day, leaving behind a wife, 2 young children, and a community in mourning. The man who pulled the trigger was Michael Styx Addison, 26 years old, with a criminal history spanning New Hampshire and Massachusetts. In the days leading up to the confrontation, Addison and his partner in crime, Antoine Bell Rogers, had committed 3 violent armed robberies and a drive-by incident. When Briggs and his partner arrived at the scene that October morning, they were walking into a situation far more dangerous than a simple domestic call. Addison was wanted, armed, and willing to do anything to avoid arrest. What makes this case especially haunting is that Briggs and Addison had crossed paths before, twice. In 2002, Briggs had arrested Addison near the Queen City Bridge in Manchester. Then, in March of 2003, Briggs responded to a scene where Addison had been wounded. Briggs administered first aid, potentially saving the life of the man who would later take his own. The irony was not lost on investigators or on Briggs' family. The officer who had shown compassion and professionalism in the line of duty was repaid with violence. Addison fled New Hampshire immediately after the incident, triggering a massive manhunt. 15 hours later, he was arrested without incident at his grandmother's apartment in Dorchester, Massachusetts. He was transported back to New Hampshire and held on $2 million bail. The case drew statewide attention, and prosecutors made a decision that hadn't been made in New Hampshire in decades. They would seek the ultimate punishment. New Hampshire had not executed anyone since 1939, when Howard Long was hanged. The state still had laws on the books, allowing for such sentences in cases of capital offenses, but no one had been sentenced to face that fate in modern times. Officer Briggs' case, however, met the legal criteria. Ending the life of a law enforcement officer in the line of duty qualified as capital involvement, and prosecutors believed the evidence was overwhelming. The trial took place in 2008. The state presented a clear narrative. Addison had ended Briggs' life at point-blank range to avoid arrest for a string of violent crimes. The jury heard testimony about Addison's criminal history, the robberies leading up to the confrontation, and the forensic evidence tying him to the scene. The defense tried to argue that Addison had acted out of fear, or that the circumstances were less clear-cut than prosecutors claimed, but the evidence was damning. After deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all charges. During the penalty phase, they had to decide whether Addison should receive life in prison or face the ultimate consequence. They chose the latter. Michael Addison became New Hampshire's only person on the state's most serious row. he was sentenced to face execution by lethal injection, marking the first such sentence handed down in the state since 1977. The decision was controversial from the start. Opponents of such punishments argued that New Hampshire should follow the path of states that had abolished it entirely. Supporters, including the family of Officer Briggs and many in law enforcement, believed it was the only appropriate response to the premeditated ending of an officer's life. Over the years, Addison's legal team filed numerous appeals. They challenged the conviction, the sentence, and the proportionality of the punishment. In 2015, the New Hampshire Supreme Court upheld both the conviction and the sentence, ruling that it was not disproportionate to penalties imposed in similar cases. The court found that the sentence had not been imposed under the influence of passion or prejudice, and that the evidence was sufficient. Addison's attorneys then took the case to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear it. Meanwhile, the political landscape in New Hampshire was shifting. Lawmakers began seriously debating whether the state should abolish the most severe sentencing option altogether. In 2019, the Democrat-controlled legislature passed House Bill 455, which repealed such punishments for all future cases. Republican Governor Chris Sununu vetoed the bill, signing the veto at a Manchester community center named in honor of Officer Briggs, with police officers and members of the Briggs family standing beside him. But the legislature overrode the veto in a bipartisan vote, and the repeal became law. Crucially, however, the legislation explicitly exempted Addison. He would remain under his original sentence. This exception created a unique legal dilemma. Addison's attorneys filed a new petition, arguing that keeping him under the original sentence violated due process and the New Hampshire Bill of Rights. Their argument was straightforward. If New Hampshire had evolved to the point where it found such punishments inconsistent with its values, how could it continue to impose that fate on one person? They pointed out that even if someone committed a worse crime today, they could not receive the same sentence Addison had, making his situation arbitrary and disproportionate. They also noted that 13 other states that had repealed similar laws had not carried out any such actions after the repeal. The state countered that Addison's sentence was still legal and constitutional. Assistant Attorney General Adriana Mikula argued that the New Hampshire Supreme Court had already ruled on this issue, and that Addison had received a fair trial with full protections of his rights. She emphasized that his sentence was not based on a random whim, but on a systematic legal process. As of late 2024, the case remains unresolved. Hearings continue, with both sides presenting arguments before the courts. Briggs' mother attends every hearing, a quiet but powerful presence, reminding everyone of the human cost behind the legal debates. She has stated that she wants justice for her son, and for her, that justice means seeing Addison's sentence carried out. Michael Addison, now 44 years old, remains in custody as New Hampshire's sole occupant of its most severe designation. If his sentence is ultimately carried out, he would be the first person executed by a jurisdiction that has since abolished such punishments, a historical anomaly that legal scholars continue to debate. If his sentence is commuted, it would represent a significant shift in how the state views justice, punishment, and evolving standards of decency. The case has become a flashpoint in discussions about crime, punishment, and the role of such sentences in modern society. For the Briggs family, it is about honoring a husband, father, and officer who gave his life protecting others. For Addison's attorneys, it is about constitutional rights and proportionality. For the state of New Hampshire, it is a question that may take years to resolve. What is certain is that Officer Michael Briggs' legacy extends far beyond the tragic night he was ended. His name appears on a memorial, a community center bears his memory, and Michael's law ensures that families of fallen officers receive financial support, and his case continues to challenge the state to define what justice truly means. And as New Hampshire grappled with questions of ultimate punishment and evolving values, another case from the state's past involved a woman who claimed divine instructions to carry out unspeakable acts. Case 9. Sheila LaBarre. The farm on Red Oak Hill Road in Epping seemed like any other rural New Hampshire property. 115 acres of land, animals roaming freely. A woman living alone after her partner passed. But when police arrived for a welfare check in March of 2006, what they discovered would turn that quiet farm into the center of one of the state's most disturbing investigations. Sheila LaBarre claimed she was an avenging angel sent by God to punish wrongdoers. The truth was far darker than divine mission. It was calculated violence disguised as righteousness. Sheila K. Bailey was born in Alabama in 1958 and grew up enduring horrors that would shape the rest of her life. According to testimony from her sister at trial, Sheila suffered repeated mistreatment at the hands of her father throughout her childhood. The trauma left scars that never healed. As a young woman, she attempted to end her own life, swallowing pills and crashing her car. She spent over a week in a coma. When she awoke, she told people she had died and met God at a table surrounded by bearded men. She claimed God told her that her work on earth wasn't finished, that she had been sent back with a mission to eliminate those who harmed children. In 1987, Sheila answered a personal advertisement placed by Wilfred Bill LaBar, a wealthy chiropractor in Epping. Though they never legally married, she took his last name and lived with him on his farm until his passing in 2000 at age 74. When he passed, Sheila claimed to be his common-law wife and inherited the entire estate, despite objections from his children from previous relationships. Some speculated that Bill's demise itself was suspicious, though Sheila was never charged in connection with it. After inheriting the property, Sheila began a pattern that would continue for years. She would lure younger men to the farm, often vulnerable individuals with learning difficulties or limited support systems. She promised them work, a place to stay, or companionship. But once they arrived, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of control, accusations, and violence. Sheila became obsessed with the idea that these men were involved in terrible acts against children, accusations that had no basis in reality, but gave her justification in her own mind to inflict punishment. Michael Deloge was one of her victims. In 2005, he disappeared from the farm. His remains would later be found decomposed in a septic tank on the property. The exact cause of his passing was never determined due to the condition of the body, but Sheila later admitted to ending his life and burning his remains. Kenneth County was 24 years old when he met Sheila through a personal advertisement in 2006. He had developmental challenges and what witnesses described as a childlike trust in others. He moved to the farm shortly after meeting her, believing he had found someone who cared about him. Instead, he found horror. Sheila filmed herself tormenting Kenny, forcing him to vomit while she accused him of being involved in harm to children. She beat him with sticks, burned him, and forced him to make false confessions on tape. In March of 2006, 2 police officers saw Kenny in a wheelchair at a Walmart, covered in burns and bruises. But no intervention happened then. Days later, Sheila ended his life with a knife and burned his body. On February 24, 2006, Kenneth's mother, Carolyn Lodge, made a panicked call to Epping police. Her son had left home with Sheila LaBar, and she was worried. Kenneth was mentally vulnerable, and something felt wrong. Sergeant Sean Gallagher knew Sheila well. He had dealt with her roughly 24 times since 1995, mostly domestic disputes with various boyfriends. He and Detective Richard Coate drove to the farm for a welfare check. When they arrived, Sheila wasn't home. The officers found multiple burn piles and a charred mattress outside. In one burn barrel, they saw what appeared to be a human bone, with flesh still attached. When Sheila returned and found police on her property, she was surprised, but tried to explain everything away. A few days later, she made a bizarre phone call to police, playing an audio recording of Kenneth confessing to being involved in harm to children, a recording she had forced him to make under duress. Police conducted another welfare check and noticed the burn pile contained what looked like human bone fragments and a pair of sneakers. A search warrant was issued. On April 2, 2006, authorities arrested Sheila after she attempted to flee. During a 3-week search of the property, investigators discovered an incinerated mattress, human bones, and blood splatter throughout the house. They also made another chilling discovery: 3 unidentified human toes found near the farm. Forensic analysis determined the remains did not belong to either Kenneth County or Michael Deloge. To this day, those toes have never been matched to any known victim, raising the disturbing possibility that Sheila's crimes extended beyond the 2 men she was charged with ending. At trial in 2008, Sheila pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense attorney described her as a deeply, deeply sick individual. Psychiatrists testified that she suffered from schizoaffective disorder and delusional disorder. Her legal team argued that she genuinely believed she was carrying out a divine mission, that her mental illness prevented her from understanding right from wrong. They presented evidence of her traumatic childhood, her suicide attempt and coma, and her detachment from reality. But prosecutors painted a different picture. They argued that Sheila was manipulative, calculated, and fully aware of what she was doing. They pointed to her pattern of luring men to the farm, her systematic torture, and her efforts to destroy evidence. Former boyfriends testified about her violent behavior. One described her breaking into his trailer with a hatchet while he slept. Another said she shot at him with a handgun as he ran through a field. The prosecution emphasized that there was no evidence whatsoever that any of her victims had been involved in harm to children. The accusations existed only in Sheila's mind, fabricated to justify her actions. The jury heard testimony about Sheila's controlling nature and violent history. James Brackett testified that he had been in an abusive relationship with her for 6 years. Wayne Ennis, whom she briefly married in 1995 before divorcing in 1996, claimed she had asked him to harm Wilfred Labar. The pattern was clear. Sheila used violence to control, manipulate, and eliminate anyone who didn't serve her purposes. On June 20th, 2008, the jury rejected the insanity defense. They found Sheila Labar guilty on 2 counts of first-degree involvement in ending lives and sentenced her to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The verdict meant that even though Sheila was deeply mentally ill, the jury determined she understood the nature of her actions and could distinguish right from wrong at the time of the offenses. Today, Sheila Labar, now 66 years old, is serving her sentence at the New Hampshire State Prison for Women in Concord. She remains one of the state's most notorious cases, a woman who claimed divine authority to justify unspeakable cruelty. The 3 unidentified toes found on her property continue to haunt investigators, a reminder that the full extent of her crimes may never be known. The case exposed how easily vulnerable individuals can be exploited, how mental illness can twist perception into delusion, and how someone can use claims of righteousness to mask pure evil. For the families of Kenneth County and Michael Deloge, no sentence could bring back their loved ones or erase the knowledge of how they suffered. And for the Epping community, the farm on Red Oak Hill Road stands as a grim reminder of the horrors that unfolded there. Sheila Labar's story is one of a woman who believed she was an angel, but acted like a demon. And in the end, the law saw through the delusion to deliver justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Yet even as Sheila Labar's farm of horrors became part of New Hampshire history, another case had already captured the nation's attention decades earlier, one involving not divine delusion, but calculated manipulation and betrayal at its most intimate. Case 10. Pamela Smart. The phone call came on May 1st, 1990, just after 10 at night. Pamela Smart's voice was frantic as she told the dispatcher she had just come home from a work meeting to find her condominium ransacked and her husband lying face down in the foyer. Greg Smart, 24 years old and barely a year into his marriage, had been ended by a single shot to the back of the head. The scene looked like a burglary gone wrong, but investigators quickly noticed something unsettling about Pamela's demeanor. She seemed oddly detached for someone who had just lost her newlywed husband. Pamela Ann Wojas had grown up in Miami before her family moved to Derry, New Hampshire, when she was in 8th grade. She attended Pinkerton Academy, where she was a cheerleader, and went on to Florida State University, graduating with a degree in communications. She met Greg Smart in 1987, and they married 2 years later, with Greg relocating to Florida to be with her during her senior year. After graduation, they settled in Derry, where Greg joined his father's insurance business, and Pamela took a job as a media coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton. 7 months into their marriage, cracks began to show. Pamela felt bored, unfulfilled, and trapped in a life that didn't match her ambitions. She had applied for a position at a local television station and been rejected. Teaching at a high school wasn't where she saw herself, and Greg, though devoted, wasn't exciting enough to fill the void. Then she met Billy Flynn. William Flynn was 15 years old, a sophomore at Winnicott High School, when he volunteered for Project Self-Esteem, an anti-substance program where Pamela also volunteered. He was soft-spoken, impressionable, and instantly captivated by the 22-year-old coordinator who paid attention to him. Pamela later claimed the relationship developed naturally, that she didn't go looking for someone to manipulate. But what started as conversation quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. By early 1990, Pamela and Billy were involved in a relationship that crossed every professional and legal boundary. They met secretly, exchanged intimate photographs, and Billy became completely devoted to her. According to his later testimony, Pamela began talking about her husband almost daily, how Greg mistreated her, how she felt trapped, how divorce would cost her everything, including the condo, her money, and even her beloved dog. She told Billy that Greg had to be gone, that it was the only way they could be together. And she made it clear that if Billy truly loved her, he would prove it. Billy Flynn confided in friends, Patrick Randall, Vance Latham Jr., and Raymond Fowler. Together, they discussed the plan that Pamela had planted in Billy's mind. On the night of May 1st, while Pamela was safely away at a work meeting, the boys put the plan into action. Latham drove them to the Smarts condominium in Derry. Flynn and Randall entered the home while Fowler waited in the car. They ransacked the place to make it look like a burglary. When Greg arrived home from work, they were waiting. Randall held a knife to his throat while Flynn forced him to kneel in the hallway. Then Billy pressed a gun to the back of Greg's head, whispered, "God forgive me," and pulled the trigger. For weeks, it seemed like the plan had worked. Police investigated the scene as a botched robbery. Pamela played the grieving widow. But investigators couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, in mid-May, an anonymous tip came in, suggesting that Cecilia Pierce, another intern at the school and a friend of both Pamela and Billy, might know something. Police approached Cecilia, and she agreed to cooperate. She wore a wire and recorded conversations with Pamela, capturing incriminating statements about the plan, the boys, and Pamela's role in orchestrating everything. On August 1st, 1990, Detective Daniel Pelletier approached Pamela in the school parking lot. She recognized him. They had spoken on at least 6 other occasions during the investigation. He told her he had good news and bad news. The good news was they had solved her husband's case. The bad news was that she was under arrest. Pamela Smart was charged with being an accomplice to first-degree involvement in ending a life, conspiracy, and witness tampering. Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, Vance Latham, and Raymond Fowler all accepted plea deals in exchange for testifying against Pamela. They pleaded guilty to second-degree charges and received sentences ranging from 28 years to life with the possibility of parole. Pamela, however, went to trial, maintaining her innocence and claiming the boys had acted on their own after she ended the relationship with Billy. The trial began in March of 1991 and became a media sensation, the first televised proceeding of its kind in United States history. Cameras filled the courtroom as prosecutors laid out their case. Billy Flynn took the stand, soft-spoken and sometimes sobbing, describing how Pamela had manipulated him into believing Greg was abusive and that ending his life was the only solution. He testified that she brought up the plan almost every day, that she threatened to end their relationship if he didn't follow through, and that she had promised the boys $500 each from a life insurance policy, totaling $140,000. Pamela's defense argued that she was being framed by teenagers trying to save themselves, but the secretly recorded conversations with Cecilia Pierce were devastating. The tapes captured Pamela coaching witnesses, discussing the plan, and trying to control the narrative. On March 22, 1991, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all charges. Greg's mother shouted, "Thank you, God," as the decision was read. Pamela Smart was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the years since, all 4 boys who physically carried out the act have been released. Billy Flynn served 25 years and was paroled in 2015. Patrick Randall was released the same day. Vance Latham and Raymond Fowler also regained their freedom after serving their sentences. Pamela Smart remains behind bars. For more than 3 decades, Pamela maintained she had nothing to do with the planning or execution of her husband's demise. She admitted to the affair, but insisted Billy acted independently. Then, in June of 2024, something changed. In a videotaped statement released as part of her latest commutation request, Pamela finally took responsibility. "I am the one to blame for his absence from this world," she said, her voice shaking. She described how she had spent years deflecting blame as a coping mechanism because accepting the truth was too painful. Despite the confession, her request for clemency was denied by Governor Kelly Ayotte in May of 2025. Pamela Smart, now 57 years old, remains incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. She has earned a doctorate in ministry and 3 master's degrees while in prison, has been ordained as a minister, and has tutored fellow inmates. But none of that has been enough to change her sentence. The case inspired the 1995 film To Die For, starring Nicole Kidman, and has been featured in countless true crime documentaries. It became a cautionary tale about manipulation, obsession, and the consequences of using another person as a weapon. For Greg Smart's family, the pain remains. His mother has attended parole hearings for the boys. His brother has spoken about the lasting trauma, and his memory is honored by those who knew him as a kind, hard-working man whose life was stolen by someone he trusted most. Pamela Smart's story is one of ambition turned toxic, of manipulation disguised as love, and of a young woman who convinced a teenager to destroy a life so she could escape a marriage she no longer wanted. And while the world has moved on, Pamela remains frozen in the consequences of that choice, serving a sentence that may never end.